Hey everyone, you're listening to the Breakthrough Innovation Podcast, where Preston and I explore the bold ideas and complex challenges shaping the future of business, technology, and the human experience. Today's guest brings a rare blend of deep financial systems expertise and cutting edge AI experimentation. After 15 years in banking IT and roles at institutions like Goldman Sachs and Bank of America, Max Winter made a leap into the cloud with AWS, where he now finds himself almost accidentally on the bleeding edge of the Gen AI revolution. As a principal solutions architect at Amazon Web Services, Max helps large financial institutions modernize their tech stacks and unlock the power of Gen AI at scale. He also brings a critical and thoughtful perspective to the deeper implications of AI, including whether it's actually fueling innovation or quietly trapping us in an infinite loop of remixing the past. Who knows? It's going to make for a great conversation. Max, I'm super excited to dive in. Really happy to have you on the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
So maybe to start off, Max, give us a little bit of background about who you are, where you come from, and how you got into AI.
Yeah, of course. I started my career at a place that was strangely enough very similar to how Amazon was starting out. So there was a big, warehouse and book printing factory where people would, take things off the shelves and put them on conveyors and box them up and ship them out. And a lot of that I got in on the IT side. So a lot of that had to do with automation and coding, but also kind of this human interactivity and usability and how do people interact with technology? How do they learn technology effectively? How do they get frustrated by technology? And that kind of, informed the rest of my career after that. I moved into banking and kind of went through the entire stack from the front end. So we were actually building, web portals. So long before React was a thing, we were basically bootstrapping something very similar to React out of raw materials, and then went back into, data warehouses, ETL tools, calculation engines, SDLC platforms. And at some point, I inherited a team and actually got into kind of this whole agile methodology and Scrum and figuring out not just why people code the way they code, but why they interact the way that they interact as a team. So it was a really, again, interesting kind of sociological side to my career. And it's carried through all the way through. And Amazon's another really interesting experiment in that, where it's a huge organization. It's not just scaling the services, it's also scaling the organization itself. So this whole concept of these two pizza teams of just enough people that you can feed them with two pizzas, working at massive scale where you have thousands of these teams interacting with each other, coordinating and kind of building something that's cohesive is just amazing, and it's a very interesting place to work as well. And then
Well,
GenAI hit, so that was the other really interesting learning opportunity for me. And again, seeing how it affects people and how people are adapting to it.
well, you are among friends. I think Preston and I, we could geek out with you on Agile on a whole different conversation. Maybe that's a new podcast
We can do that.
episode. I do think, though, the concept of AI, it gets so much attention these days, and it's usually a lot of hype. So part of the reason I'm so excited about today's conversation is maybe we can talk a little bit about the risk to level set, just so everyone's kind of working from the same spot. From your experience with large language models, how do these models actually, and I'll say this with air quotes, how do they actually think? And what are some of the biggest misconceptions people have?
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's actually, there's some really interesting research that Anthropic is doing on that. They've published a paper about, actually showing how the model reasons about, something like how do you, multiply large numbers or anything like that, things that they never taught it to do. But at its core, it's really just statistics about what a human would do in that situation. So if you think about, like, how do you teach somebody to draw a cat, right? You draw oval and triangle, your ears and whiskers, that's catty sort of, right? So eventually, if you show enough of that, right, you're not actually teaching it to repeat the same exact drawing over and over. You're teaching it generally, here's a bunch of drawings, this is a cat, this is a cat, this is a cat. So it eventually picks up those patterns. Right. So that's kind of classical AI. The non-generative AI was more like classification. So, tell me if this is a cat, or, the old muffin versus Chihuahua data
Yeah,
set,
like heuristic models.
where you can't tell which ones are the muffins, which ones are the Chihuahuas. That's the challenge. But they look similar. What can you do? But as far as actually, outputting large amounts of things, right? You could tell just, a small number of classifications, but that's about it. With large language models, the big advancement is you can now generate a large work based on that, right? So you tell it, write me a poem, and it writes you a long poem. You tell it, write me, draw me a painting, it draws you a painting, right? So the question is, how is it doing that? And really, the core of it is it's picking up on patterns in the data that it's seen. So that's both the advantage that it kind of understands what, catness means and dogness means. And so you can ask it for, picture of a cat astronaut, by, I don't know, Vincent van Gogh. So it understands what catness and astronautness and Vincent van Goghness means, and kind of knows how to
Blend
what
them together.
yeah what the sum of those three things would be. But in terms of what it can't do, it's really more where you go towards the edge of the training data. If it's never seen a platypus, it's going to be very hard for it to know what a platypus is, right? It might take a guess, it'll be random, right? And a lot of what people have done with AI in terms of AI inventing things has been more in terms of kind of randomizing the data and saying, does this, if we gave you this random input, does that look right? No. Okay, what about, you do that millions of times a second, you get some really interesting results, right? But yeah, so the key thing is it's really just statistics about what it's seen humans do in the past, or whatever the input data is, the variation that's seen in that data.
So that, I mean, to me, that sounds like a massive copycat. So if that's the case, what's the real difference between human creativity and AI creativity?
That's a great question. So it's really, part of it is that AI, at least generative AI, the way that works right now, is trained in, these massive batches. You get, whatever, GPT of this year, or Claude, 3.0, then half a year later you get 3.5. Right, so there's a lot of data that goes through the model training process that the model really kind of picks up from, but that's it. After that, it's frozen. So all of these conversational, interactive kind of things are really kind of an illusion that's being put on by the application, where it's really refeeding the model your entire conversation. It says, okay, it's not that the model's remembering you, it's you said this, and then I answered this, and now I'm asking you this, right? It's replaying that. Then it answers, it says, okay, you said this, I answered that, now I'm saying this, then you answered that, now I'm asking this new thing. It's replaying that thing into the model each time, so it's kind of learning a little bit in the context, but then once that conversation's over, it forgets it, and you're back to the starting point of the model. So really, you're locked into whatever the model learned when it was originally trained, right? Humans don't do that. Humans kind of are learning all the time. They get new kind of signals from the outside world. If you think that you're going to do something and it doesn't work out, you try to think about why it didn't work out. You learn from that really in real time. And the other thing is, I think a lot of, so there was a really nice book called Thinking Fast and Slow a bunch of years ago, where it defined
Yeah.
this, kind of system one, system two. So system one is like your gut feel, right? This looks right. Right. I think the answer is 25. Right. Mary had a little lamb. Okay, got it. Right. You get these associations you don't have to think about. And then there's system two, where you actually step back and it's like, wait, how do I know that two times something is? You start thinking about exactly how you derived that, and you start self-analyzing, figuring out when you learned that, whether that person might have been wrong, all of that stuff. So that doesn't really happen. You can kind of emulate it. So you can do this reasoning thing that is being rolled out now, where you can, in the context, the model can kind of talk to itself and say, okay, well, this person would say, let's say philosophers, right? Plato would say this, Aristotle would say this, and therefore, right, make conclusions based on that. But again, it's repeating those kinds of, it's not really thinking so much as writing what a human would have written when asked that question. That's actually one of the big insights when people are talking to LLMs, like when they have this idea that there's, this Terminator hiding behind the facade, that, if they just kind of talk to it long enough, they can get the evil robot to pop out. It's not an evil robot, right? If you tell it to act as an evil, to predict what an evil robot would say if asked this question, it will tell you what an evil robot would say. That's all there is. right?
So, I mean, it sounds like what you're saying is it's a mimic, it's a simulation to some extent that doesn't really have the ability to go outside the data set it's given. So when I think about that, you've talked about AI trapping us in this loop of remixing the past, which is really interesting when you think about it from an innovation perspective. Like innovation is thinking outside the box, breaking the loop. So maybe give us a little bit of background about what you mean by trapping us in the loop of remixing the past.
Absolutely. So it's, I mean, at its core, you can, I mean, bias became a very dirty word recently, but it's all about bias, right? So you're basically saying, what would a human say in this case, right? What do most cats look like? What do most dogs look like? So you're kind of, you're getting these, again, gut feeling ideas of what different concepts mean. And that's actually, again, something that Anthropic published some really interesting explainability research. So they found that they have, just clusters of, pieces of the model. They call them neurons that are responsible for understanding what, things like Obama-ness means, right? All things that have to do with President Obama, right? It just, Golden Gate Bridge-ness, right? They had this idea of Golden Gate Claude, where they basically just amplified the idea of the Golden Gate Bridge, and they asked the model, what is it? It said, I'm the Golden Gate Bridge, this is, it just basically everything it thought about was about the Golden Gate Bridge. So you can have these kind of places in the model that you can identify as having to do with ideas, but those ideas are kind of gravity, right? So you have the idea of, a cat and an astronaut and all of that. And those come from somewhere, right? Those come from some place in the training data. And you can actually trace that, or you can sometimes see that, especially if there's not a lot of variation. So actually, I published a little story on LinkedIn a couple of weeks back about the whole, the whole Studio Ghibli thing. But one of the examples that I used is, try to generate an Italian plumber, cartoon of an Italian plumber. And for the Midjourney models, they kept coming out Mario. Like you type in Italian cartoon plumber in blue, you get four Marios, right? You get like an anime Mario and whatever, Yu-Gi-Oh Mario and this and that, but they're all Mario. And that's because that's the main thing that the model knows about Italian plumbers, or at least cartoon Italian plumbers. You can come away from it, and there's a nice kind of, I try to step back and I say, okay, just a cartoon plumber, it comes back with like a, Fix-It Felix kind of guy that's not Mario. And then if you keep, if you add, in blue and then you add a mustache, you get Mario. So it kind of snaps right back to what it knows. So it's almost like, again, like gravity, like, black hole or something that kind of pulls it towards certain concepts. And it's very hard for it to really get away from it. So on the one hand, yeah, you have to be aware that it's doing that. But the other end of the stick is, if you're using this thing to do something truly novel, you have to also be aware that it's kind of pulling you towards these kind of, attractors, these points of gravity. So I was actually working on a piece of code at Amazon that was, something that was truly new, so, new algorithm. And this was on a coding model. So I explained to it, write me the normal way that people do this. Great, fine, I wrote it, fine, excellent, you learned in college. Now make this change. Okay, it's trying to make this change, not making the change, going back to what you learned in college. I make the change by hand, right? I say, okay, now, make it a little bit nicer. Undoes the change, goes back to what you learned in college. So it's, again, the people need to understand that there is this pressure under the surface to get you back to the known concepts. So that's really part of, some of it you can absolutely put human input into the loop and say, okay, here's, I'm making up something brand new. Here's a character. I'm going to describe the character to you. I'm going to make it, what I want it to be. And now you're going to write me a story about that character. That works very well. If I just say, write me a story about a pirate, that goes out to Saudi Arabia, you're going to get sent back, right? It's very easy to do that. And it's very easy to be lazy and just let the machine do that. And so that's really where the kind of cycle of sameness comes in, because at the end of the day, even if you think you're publishing something new and other people are reading something new, it's kind of a rehash of the same ideas. You're not really having those kind of, Pablo Picasso, let's do cubism. Nobody's ever done this before. And it's not really learning from that either, unless it gets popular enough to get into the next version of the model.
So Max, I guess just to recap from my mind, it sounds like AI can be really effective in environments where you have standards and you want standards and you want to have some of that gravity. In situations where you want true innovation, it becomes really dangerous
I
because
mean,
it
yeah.
reinforces the standard instead of expanding for the innovation.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, at its heart, it's statistics. So, yes. And it's absolutely stellar at automating routine and with, fuzziness. If you want to, again, if you want to sort your images, you want to detect all the ones that have dogs in them. If you want to detect all the things that look like bombs, all the things that look like cancer, absolutely brilliant. Right? If you want to do something new, I mean, I wouldn't say it's dangerous, but you need to be aware that there is this pull, right? It's like
Right.
if you're in space, you go too close to something, you need to know that you're going to get pulled towards it. You need to compensate for it. That's all.
Yeah.
I love that. Now, I know as Max, as we move into kind of the wrap up phase of the episode, I'm curious, what's a question that more people should be asking about AI that hasn't been talked about enough?
So I think the big question is what jobs is AI going to actually create, right? Where do humans fit into this equation given the limitations of AI, given that it's going to get cheaper and faster and more ubiquitous, right? I think that there is, right, every industrial revolution, everybody says, okay, well, we're not going to be, what are we going to do with all the farmers? What are we going to do with all the blacksmiths, right? What are we going to do with all the weavers? It's the end of the economy. Everybody's going to be unemployed. No, right? We create something new. Something new emerges. So that's really the key thing to think about is where what do the new tools give us that we never could do before that will now be enabled to do because it's so much easier, faster, and cheaper than we could possibly do with humans that it wasn't practical to do. So what things are going to emerge from those that people can do for a full-time job? And then the second one is just, what is it that people will still be better at than AI, in terms of the long-term progress of the human race? What kind of things can people do? So those introspective, those ideas of, how do I know what I know? How how do I
Right.
find out? That's actually a huge problem right now. Is just the idea of truth and the idea of there's a scientific paper saying anything you can possibly want to say. So which of those scientific papers is right? Those are the kinds of
Yeah.
things that I think humans need to kind of give their input into and use these new tools to actually enable themselves to do that.
Now, Max, if someone's interested in kind of diving into the philosophy or even the nuts and bolts of AI, what's the best way for them to get into contact with you?
Contact is just if you look for Max Winter AWS, probably my LinkedIn will pop up. Uh, Send me a connection request. Tell me you're not spamming. Tell me it's about AI. I'll be very
But
happy
isn't
to
that
have a
what a
conversation.
spammer would say?
Only if yes, especially if they were
Yeah.
using AI. We'll wait.
No, I think that's great though. I
I
mean, that,
agree.
that LinkedIn
Yeah.
request, that's a good place to go. Max, thank you so much for the time. This has been a great conversation. For everyone who's listened all the way to the end, take a moment, go to the comments and let us know how you've used AI in innovation and how you've fought that gravity effect that Max is talking about here. And then leave a rating, leave a review. That always helps us out a lot. And then lastly, if you know anyone who's struggling with ways to use AI in innovation, send them this episode, share the wealth of knowledge, and introduce them to Max. So all in all, thank you for the time, Max. This has been fantastic. For everyone who listened to the end, thank you as well. And we'll see you all next time on Breakthrough Innovation.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Max.